Well, retailers in Christchurch Central City say their biggest concern is youth crime, including assaults, theft, and ram raids. Don't forget there was another ram raid even just in Heathcote over the weekend. Christchurch Central MP Duncan Webb says the media focuses too much on isolated cases and retailers haven't contacted him with any concerns. So what does National Party leader Christopher Luxon say? He is with me now, and hello to you.
Good morning, Chris. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Even reading the front page of the New Zealand Herald online today, four more cases of serious crime in Auckland. You got crime in Christchurch. There is a crime wave happening. There's no doubt about it. What are the answers and what are the solutions?
Well, look, I think the government's got the balance all wrong on this. I think, first and foremost, we've got to be thinking about victims of crime and, that they seem to be forgotten, I think, a lot in this conversation. And then we've got to be much tougher, I think, on serious offenders. You've got to remember that 1 in 4 of these crimes are actually committed by repeat offenders. And so I think we've got to be able to sort of make sure we've got appropriate consequences for offenders in place. I do think we've got to then really target these young people that are at risk. And I think there's a role for schools and communities and parents to play there. And then I do think, we I know the government will dispute it, but we think at least, close to 10% of this is gang affiliated or gang associated as well. And so I think, sending a message being tough on gangs is important too.
We can be tough on gangs, but if it's youth crimes, I mean, what some of the retailers are telling me, they're in their school uniforms. They're assaulting people during the day. This is the retailers, that is, and they don't know what to do. In fact, some are suggesting they don't even want to go to work anymore because they're too scared.
Yeah, and that's a common theme that, I've spoken to a lot of these victims who've been ram raided or broken into multiple times, and that's how they feel as well. There's high levels of anxiety and stress. They don't feel it's a safe place at all for them or their families to be in at their workplace, and that's the primary responsibility of government, is to protect its citizens. And so they're not feeling safe in their own job, in their own houses, in their own businesses, in their own communities. But look, I mean, I think there's something we've got to do about targeting these young people. I mean, the first and foremost thing, Chris, is that why we're getting school age kids is because we've now got 55% of our kids not going to school regularly. We've got 100,000 kids in New Zealand that are now chronically truant. And so the Minister of Police now is also the Minister of Education. I suspect Chris Hipkins should have a chat with himself, because there's not enough effort about being made around truancy in particular. And it's not just COVID related or illness related. Less than half of it's associated with that. There's something else going on, and we've got to be able to get our kids back into school. I think secondarily, the government has a responsibility to make sure that we're actually tracking some of this stuff. There's a lot more work we could be doing to power up some good community organisations. I've met with quite a few here in Auckland around, and known them for many years, that do great work as big brothers. They're often, these kids are missing male role models, positive male role models, and that's why they get attracted to sort of the bling and the fact that gangs can get away with stuff with impunity, and gangs become attractive. But then the other thing we've got to ask the question is, as parents, what the hang's going on when you actually don't know where your 12-year-old is between midnight and 5 a.m. in the morning? And, there's a call to responsibility to parents. Hey, listen, you had these kids. We've got to be able to make sure we're doing our job right, which is to set some boundaries in place and know where they are. And surely our job as parents is to make sure our kids are in school, so they've got opportunities that we didn't have, and they can get ahead and do better than us. And so there's quite a lot there. There is also, I think, on the crime side, we don't want first-time offenders to become hardened criminals by getting into the justice system in the way, in that way. So I think for minor and first-time offences, but there is a set of tools that the government has available that aren't necessarily being used, and they range from, family group conferences. There's a lot of those going on. There's a better use, I think, of community service and home detention that could be used. And then I think the third thing about, residential youth facilities for serious repeat offenders is probably entirely appropriate.
There are more homeless people in Christchurch now than there were pre-COVID-19. Interesting, a YMCA manager here in Christchurch has blamed National, saying Labor is still picking up the pieces from the last previous administration, having done nothing for 9 years. I thought that was a rather interesting comment to make, and I thought, really? You're going to blame the previous government? But anyway, what are your thoughts on that? This is what a YMCA manager in Christchurch said, squarely blamed the national government for at least not acknowledging the housing crisis.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this government's been in power now for almost 5 to 6 years, and they've been an abject, utter failure on housing. And the housing problem is actually all very much interrelated, right? If you can't buy a house, you end up renting one. rents are up $150 a week since the government came to power. If you can't rent one, you end up going on a state housing list. The state housing list is up 4 times now to 27,000 people. And if you can't get a state house, you end up in emergency housing or homeless, as you just said. So, and on the other side, when you start to come at it from, the bottom up, from homelessness, you sit there and go, well, the government's talked a big game, but hasn't done a single thing to help improve addiction services, for example. There are some very good programs across this country that should be powered up, scaled up to help people that. There's other good community organisations. I was in Nelson the other day at a place called the Mail Room, where they work with a lot of male homelessness. And the stories there are quite consistent in terms of the patterns of a lot of people from state care, a lot of sexual abuse, and then these guys out on the street. And this organisation is doing a fantastic job. And so why wouldn't we power up, scale them up, fund them more to be able to support and help people transition out of homelessness into some sort of housing arrangement? And then I think, as you've seen with emergency housing, it's a complete and utter disaster. And there needs to be an effort to sort of say, look, that's got to be bounded to a 6-week period or something like that. And then we have to work really hard to get people into proper housing. And so, and whether that's in the private market or whether it's through, Kāinga Ora, or whether it's through community housing providers, we could be doing a lot more around community housing providers, people like the Salvation Army and different Māori property trusts that actually want to build these houses, build good pastoral care, build good communities. I've been in some of these facilities when they've opened up, and we do probably a third less community housing providers than what they do in Australia, and yet they just need some access to some capital. So it should be foot on the accelerator with Kāinga Ora building state houses, and foot on the accelerator with community housing providers to tackle these problems, which are all very interrelated. And at the end of the day, the government campaigned very, very strongly on this back in 2017, said they'd fix it. We've got 4 times the number of people living in cars now. We've got 4 times the number of kids living in, 4 times the increase in people on the state house wait list, 4,500 people waking up in a motel today, or families waking up in a motel today. So kind words and saying you care doesn't cut it. You've actually got to take action, and you've got to go through each of those component parts and get into problems and what's causing those problems and sort it out.
Part of the problem, though, too, here in Christchurch is that you've got unscrupulous developers that have been marketing their tiny dog kennels as solving the housing crisis. They haven't. All they've done is sold them to investors, and a lot of these dog kennels in Christchurch in the central city are absolutely vacant because they're used as Airbnbs. They were supposed to be solving the housing crisis. Now we've got a situation where the government wants to intensify housing development, and that sounds good in practice. But in theory, though, developers are rubbing their hands saying, great, a 50 square metre box for $800,000. We'll be rich. Doesn't solve the housing crisis, though, does it?
No, and I think there's things that you could be doing, though. I mean, if you want to get people into the private rental market, I mean, what you don't do is extend the bright line test and actually remove interest deductibility. Those two pieces have probably added about $40 to $50 a week to average rents across the country. So, it's just, again, Chris, it's all these component parts that are interrelated, and you have to kind of work your way through each and individual part of it. You could actually go to the private market and say, right, what else do we need to be doing to sort of get the private market to take on some of the people that are ending up in emergency housing, for example. But they would need, there'd be a bunch of risk around insurance, there'd be a bunch of risk around a bunch of other things. So long story short is what I'm trying to say is there are solutions, they're hard solutions, but you've actually got to go through each of the component parts because they're quite linked with each other.
Final few questions. Is it time to do away with masks and get the country into a green traffic light setting now? I mean, in Christchurch, when I walk around some of the restaurants and cafes now, people don't bother wearing a mask inside anymore. It seems like it's those days have come to an end. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, I think there's several things we need to do. I mean, we've said the traffic light system is a complication and complexity we don't need. We would have, we've been talking about it now for 6 or 7 months, saying it's just a waste of time in the world of Omicron. No one's following it anyway, so get rid of that. Secondarily, 5 days isolation, I think, is fine, as we're seeing in other countries, in the US, and I think Australia's going that way. I think it should be test to work for everybody, not just critical workers. The reality is every worker is now critical. So, frankly, if you've got a negative test, even if you're even got someone at home isolating, you should be good to go to work. And the last thing, as you say, on masks is, look, I'd just be saying, where is the biggest risk? It's sitting in healthcare and our aged care sector. That's probably the need for masks. Everywhere else, it should be personal choice.
The government's dramatic U-turn on what's been described by, I think, nearly everybody as the Kiwisaver tax. You've got Labour activists who are saying it was never a tax on Kiwisaver, and they've accused you of misinformation. But that's semantics, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, it was a tax on the funders, perhaps, right? But that
Yep.
tax was always going to, or the GST rather, was always going to be passed on to the consumer. So, but you have been accused of misinformation. So has every mainstream media, according to these diehard Labour activists. That's dangerous in a way, isn't it? Because now everybody's being accused. If you disagree with something, you're now accused of misinformation.
Yeah, I think it's
How have we got to this level now of silliness?
Well, I think it's just an easy political cop out, isn't it? When you don't want to face up and say, "Look, I got that one wrong," and that's what you need to do is to apologise, say we got it wrong, that like the cost of living payment, and here's what we're doing to fix it, so we're not wasting your taxpayers' money. But what's going on really here is look, this government's addicted to spending. They're spending like never before. The biggest spending government we've ever seen in the history of New Zealand. And then they're going to keep dreaming up ways to try and find written tax, because when you spend like that and you don't get outcomes or results, you end up having to find new sources of tax. And that's exactly what this was. And so, and they've done it through stealth, right? We've got fuel taxes, we've got ute taxes, we've got landlord taxes, as we just talked about. It just keeps going, and so they'll keep coming with lots of crazy ideas because they have to, because they need to tax, and when they can't manage money, they end up coming after yours. It's that simple. So, yeah, look, they can call it what they want to call it. I get it, but let's just call it for what it is. It was a tax grab.
Christopher Luxon, nice to have you on the program.
Great to be with you, Chris. You take care.